Welcome to the panel webinar on developing resilience to systemic hazards, and COVID-19 is certainly a great example of a systemic hazard. My name is Renee Fry-McKibben, and I am Professor of Economics at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University and co-director of the research program COVID-19 and a Macroeconomy with Joaquim Vespignani. So let me introduce our panelists for today. If Anne and Sunil could please turn on their cameras and join the panel. So our panelists today are Anne Florini and Sunil Sharma. Anne and Sunil have recently published a really interesting article of systemic hazards in the Finance and Development magazine, which is a publication of the IMF. So let me introduce each one. Anne Florini is clinical professor at the Thunderbird School of Global Management, Arizona State University, where she directs programs at the Washington, D.C. campus. Her teaching and research focus on complex systems, the climate crisis, energy policy, and cross-sector collaborations involving business, government, and civil society. Throughout her career, Professor Florini has spearheaded major international projects focused on innovative approaches to global problem solving for such organizations as the Initiative for Policy Dialogue and the World Economic Forum. Dr. Florini previously taught at the National University of Singapore, where she founded and led the Centre on Asia and Globalization and ran the unique Masters of Tri-Sector Collaboration. She has held senior appointments at such research institutes as the Brookings Institution and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Her numerous books and articles have addressed China's governance, transparency, and information flows in governance, the roles of civil society in the private sector, and climate and energy policy. Professor Florini received her PhD in political science from the University of California in Los Angeles and a Master in Public Affairs from the School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. So welcome, Anne. Sunil Sharma is a distinguished visiting scholar at the Institute for International Economic Policy at the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. He's also Senior Associate at the Council on Economic Policies in Switzerland. He was Assistant Director in the IMF's Research Department from 2015 to 2018 and the Director of the IMF Singapore Regional Training Institute in Singapore from 2006 to 2015. Before moving to Singapore in 2006, Sunil was Chief of the IMF's Institute's Asian Division in Washington, D.C. Prior to joining the IMF in 1992, he was on the economics faculty at UCLA. From 2012 to 2020, he was on the governing board of the Mysore Royal Academy School of Business in India. During 2012 to 2018, he was a member of the advisory board at the Sim Kee Boon Institute for Financial Economics at Singapore Management University. And over 2011 to 2015, he served on the International Advisory Board at the Institute of Global Finance at the Australian School of Business at the University of New South Wales. Sunil has a PhD and an MA in economics from Cornell University, an MA from the Delhi School of Economics, and a BA with honours from St. Stephen's College in Delhi University. He's published widely on economics and financial topics, and his current interests include rethinking capitalism, systemic hazards, complex systems, the international financial architecture, and the institutional structure and design of financial regulation. So before I hand over to Anne and Sunil, I'd like to let you know that this event is being recorded and will be available on the CARMA website in the next few days. If you'd like to ask a question of the panelists, please use the Q&A button on Zoom. So I will now hand over to Sunil and Anne to present their thoughts.
Thank you very much, Renee. And let me share my screen and show you some pictures. So first of all, let me go to slide 1. First of all, let me thank Renee and Kama and the Crawford School very much for extending us this kind invitation. We've been very much looking forward to doing this. We want to start off by giving you a little bit of a summary and a bit of a heads up as to what we are all about here. And we're going to start by explaining how it is that we came to write this article on reckoning with systemic hazards. As Renee described, we've been working on what seem to be quite separate spheres. My work has mostly been on global governance with particular applications in energy and environment, and Sunil's been focused on financial regulation and macroprudential risk lately. But in a series of conversations, we came to see a set of commonalities and interactions across what had appeared to be these separate spheres. And that led to the article, which was particularly influenced by the outbreak of the pandemic. And in the article, we are arguing that the COVID-19 pandemic is forcing what is really an overdue reckoning with a whole set of systemic hazards and with the world's ability or lack thereof to manage them. So what does it really mean to reckon with systemic hazards? Well, we see that they have underlying similarity of complexity and fragility, that we need to be thinking about these kinds of hazards somewhat differently from the way we have thought about governance before. And that's the focus of today's seminar. And our core argument is that all the spheres and the systems can be made more resilient, which means both more robust and more adaptable.
So it's helpful to think in terms of three interacting spheres that are fundamental to human well-being. And in all three, we are seeing systemic fragilities. The first sphere is the political realm, how we organize ourselves to manage our common or shared problems. And this includes the global order, where we are seeing rising tensions between and within countries. The second sphere is the economic and financial system or systems. While we have seen a reduction in global poverty, income and wealth inequality has soared within countries. And for many, the income increases have been precarious at best. The third sphere is the natural environment in which human systems are inherently intertwined and which we seem to be rapidly destroying with consequences that we don't fully understand, right? Rising sea levels, dead zones in oceans, massive heat waves and fires, floods, species extinction, ecosystem collapse. So it's interesting to not just look at each sphere separately, but look at their sort of complicated interactions.
And before we get into looking at those interactions, let's dive a little bit deeper into each of these areas, more to get our heads into a common space, because I think all of this will be fairly familiar to this audience. We have to remember that political turmoil did not come with the pandemic, and it did not come with the murder of Floyd King. 2019 was already a year of extraordinary public protests all around the world. This photo happens to have been taken in Chile, and you may remember that unrest in Chile became so pervasive that they had to move the climate negotiations out of the country. Hong Kong, et cetera, et cetera. This is not new to this year and our extreme circumstances this year. We're seeing sustained public unhappiness with governments, often with reason. There is evidence that in at least some countries, political systems really are much more open to the preferences of certain elites than they are to the preferences of the broader public. And we've been seeing the rise of national populism, political polarization, including in leading democracies. We have really seen a breakdown in trust, in basic trust in institutions and in each other. If you saw the Edelman Barometer, which studies such things, came out in January 2020, so before this year's particular problems, they found that for the first time, there is no sector of society, not government, not business, not civil society, that is well trusted. And that is a really frightening statement, because if there is no trust in any kind of authority, how do we deal with large-scale complex problems? As Sunil started to mention, we've already seen also that the global order that had underpinned some degree of stability and prosperity around the world is currently rudderless and may be completely disintegrating. And COVID-19 is shining an ever stronger spotlight on these systems and these political fragilities.
So let's look at the economic sphere, right? I mean, policy responses to the 2008 financial crisis prevented collapse, but did not put us on the path to sustainable and inclusive growth. Well over a decade after the crisis, we were still dealing with structural challenges like inadequate health and social security systems, differential access to education systems, soaring debt levels for households, firms, and governments, inequalities in income and wealth, deficiencies in corporate governance, weak government oversight and regulation, and destruction of the environment. And this was before COVID arrived. Now, as Anne mentioned, COVID-19 is shining a bright light on the cracks and vulnerabilities of the system. You know, the gig economy is seriously stressed, and we're trying to patch it up as best as we can. Inequalities are rising further, and the burden is being borne by poor, low-wage employees, both in terms of income loss and risk of infection. The costs and disruptions associated with COVID-19 are making our economic and financial systems even more fragile.
So in the last bit of cheerful news for the day, let's look at the global environment and the kind of planetary upheaval we're seeing. Now, of course, you can't do a discussion on the global environment without having a picture of the globe, but this one has a particular point to it. If you look at the middle here, you'll see this big brown swath over what should be the blue Atlantic Ocean. This is a picture I got from NASA a couple of months ago that is showing the effects of a big sandstorm in the Sahara Desert on its way to the shores of North America. This is not something that people caused, but it's a nice visual demonstration of the degree to which we all affect each other, that we are living on a planet of deeply interconnected systems that we don't usually pay attention to. The other picture may be particularly familiar to this audience, showing Australia burning in the fires of a few months ago. Now, this is not a picture, it's actually a composite of a set of the bushfires in Australia for about a month in December 2019. But it does give a sense of the scale of what the climate problem is driving us toward. And we could have done a similar picture of California today. So we're getting a sense of the scale of the environmental crisis that we face, and it's beginning to be recognized, at least in most parts of the world. The battered oceans, the collapsing ecosystem, the mass extinctions, the extreme weather, the rising sea levels that are a threat to coastal cities around the world, the degree to which some parts of the planet may, in the next few decades, literally become too hot for human habitation. And all of this is already generating refugee flows, undermining agriculture, and interrupting supply chains. It turns out that these natural systems are both more intricate, complex, and easier to disrupt than we had previously understood. And our standard toolkit, our policy toolkit, has been proving really inadequate to deal with these interconnected systems. We can't just treat environmental issues as a set of unconnected externalities.
So here, let me outline some interaction of the spheres, and then I'll take the pandemic as an example. So let's look at the first column. The first column, we're looking at an economy which is generating rising inequality and a physical environment marked by climate volatility and collapsing ecosystems. That makes it harder for the average household to fend for itself, which leading to more divisive politics and less societal resilience. Think of this, look at the second column. Here we have corporate and financial sectors that focus solely on profits while shirking responsibility for the environment and society, coupled with weak governance. Now that's likely to worsen both inequality and the climate emergency. The third column, a climate crisis coupled with dysfunctional governance is going to be bad for business and the financial sector, as extreme weather disrupts supply chains and drives workers to unwanted migration. So the point here is to point out that these three spheres are really, really interlinked, that we can't think of risks in one without thinking in risks in the other two, or thinking about the overall decision frameworks that we're really dealing with. So let's take the pandemic as an example. It is fundamentally a health crisis. It's acutely disrupting the labor market and society by limiting our ability to collaborate and function normally. Countries are selectively putting their economies in comas to fight the virus. To do this, households, firms, and subnational governments must be supported by the central or federal governments. Now, our political, economic, financial, legal, and social systems are being stressed at the same time. Climate volatility is making it harder to deal with the virus. And the pandemic in turn is making it harder to respond to climate events like the fires in California. So here we have it. We have a health crisis, which is morphing into an economic crisis, which could morph into a prolonged debt crisis, which could have long-term consequences for society and political regimes. Now, success here is going to depend on state administrative and fiscal capacity, social trust and norms of behavior, and very importantly, leadership. Leadership within individual countries and leadership globally.
So let's take a moment and look at the underlying framework that Sunil and I have been using to think about all this. Our argument is that societies are complex systems, not complicated systems, and that there really is a difference between the two. You can think of a complicated system as one in which there are lots of parts, but the parts add up to something that is predictable, like an old machine. If you swap out some bad parts for some good parts, you can pretty well predict what the outcome is going to be. It's a very mechanistic approach, and it has been how we have tended to think of particularly economies, but to some degree societies as well. Complex systems, we are beginning to understand, operate fundamentally differently. In a complex system, you have a large number of interacting agents who are very heterogeneous, of many, many different types and many different scales. The number and the range of interactions and the types of agents are just too great for there to be an understanding of what their interactions are going to add up to. They are not predictable. They are fundamentally different from mechanical structures. Machines you can tinker into an optimal performance. A complex system, you really can't. The whole notion of optimization doesn't make sense. Let me give you an example of a complex system and what happens when you try to deal with it as though it is complicated. And for this, I'm going to use a forest. In particular, talk about how the German scientific forestry management that started in the late 1700s initially worked beautifully until it absolutely failed, which makes it a useful example for thinking about what can go wrong when you try to deal with a complex system as though it's complicated. In the late 1700s and into the 1800s, timber was an enormously important factor of production. And so it made great sense for the German state to be looking for ways to optimize the production of certain kinds of timber. A lot of state revenues depended on it. It's really important to the economy. And so the scientific forest management approach was to optimize the production of the species of trees that were useful for timber purposes. And in order to do that, the forest managers just got rid of everything else. All of the alternate species, all of the underbrush, etc., basically turned them into relatively sterile environments that were optimized for producing a certain kind of tree. And this actually worked well, even for a number of decades, because as it turned out, there was enough resilience in the natural system that they could withstand this treatment for that amount of time. So it looked like it was a roaring success until a few decades went by when productivity simply collapsed. It turns out that a forest, it's a good example of a complex system, is actually made up of thousands of different species that are everything from trees to other kinds of plants, to fungi, to microbes. Much of the life is actually happening under the ground where we can't even see it. But without that interaction, you do not have the soil, you do not have the nutrients, you do not have what the trees need in order to thrive. And so once the resilience had been fully drained out of the system, productivity simply collapsed. Our argument is that this is a good metaphor for what we've done with a whole number of systems, that we've deliberately, in the name of efficiency, drained the resilience out of human systems, social systems, natural systems, denigrating what's actually resilience as redundancy and inefficiency. That's a fine approach for predictable systems like machines that you can optimize. It's wildly dangerous for complex systems like economies and natural ecosystems. So if you want to cover systemic hazards which come out of these complex systems, it requires major changes in the way we think and the ways we make decisions. Our current political systems are very good at complicated problems, or they can be very good at complicated problems when they're based on problems that have known distributions, like that normal distribution. They can apply rules that are based on experience and analysis that is based on experience, on historical data. There is agreement on where the future is likely to take us, at least to some degree. And it makes sense for these kind of complicated problems to divide decision-making into narrow silos where you can have a lot of expertise. But it doesn't work our governance systems don't work for systems that inherently require expertise across a number of silos and that are inherently unpredictable because the unexpected emerges from the interaction of many, many parts. What we need to do now is to make resilience at least as important as efficiency in our thinking. We have to be aware of the multi-layered interactions across many different kinds of actors and factors. We have to recognize that these systems are characterized by feedback loops, path dependencies, time lags between cause and effect, tipping points, in a bewildering variety. And we have to face the reality that these systemic hazards are characterized by complexity with its inherent uncertainty, which results in ambiguity. So even when you have data, different people can look at the same data and come out to very different conclusions.
So when we were studying how to handle systemic hazards, we sort of came up with 5 principles which we thought would help us achieve resilience. And resilience here, as Anne has mentioned, we're defining as robust and adaptable, because you want a system which is tough enough, which is strong enough to deal with the shocks that it's continuously subjected to. And it should be adaptable in the sense that as things change, it can cope with setbacks, barriers, resource limitations. And there we have the sense of flexibility, durability, and tolerance. So we came up with these 5 principles for governing systemic hazards. So the first one is robustness. As Anne has said, that you want to make choices that are not narrowly optimized just for efficiency, but also that will work in a wide range of future scenarios. And these choices should be flexible enough to allow you to take advantage of opportunities, but should not be constraining because you don't have a sense of what future interventions may be necessary. That's part and parcel of the uncertainty, the complexity of a complex system. The second principle is multi-layered governance. As Anne described, multiple layers of interactions, you need multi-layered governance. And what do we mean by that? Complex societies need both integrated and broad perspectives to make good decisions. So we're looking at whole of government approaches and whole of society solutions. So collaboration between the public, policymakers, experts, and other stakeholders regarding knowledge, experience, interpretation, concerns, and perspectives is critical. Empowerment of self-organization. Now here, we're trying to address the heterogeneity of people, concerns, and effects. It's almost impossible for a central authority to have the information or the ability to deal with systemic fragility that can manifest itself in different ways in different places. But policymakers can do much to inform, empower, and coordinate bottom-up responses. And I think that the COVID pandemic is an example where governments have had to coax people, have had to convince people to do certain things that they normally wouldn't do. Communication, difficult but critical. Hard to agree on a set of policies or structural changes without some shared understanding of the nature of the complex problems we face. Public comprehension generates trust and collective ownership of decisions. Again, the pandemic is a very good example where countries that have not properly communicated to the public have had problems trying to organize certain kinds of responses. And horizon scanning and early action, I think this is fundamental to dealing with systemic risks, because preemptive reduction of systemic vulnerabilities is key. We have to be able to discern signs of emerging problems that could cause systemic disruption. I mean, typically when systemic risk becomes obvious, it's generally too late. And the recent global financial crisis and the current pandemic have made it clear that systemic disruptions inflict huge societal costs. So we must motivate our leaders to focus on prevention.
So before we draw all this to a conclusion, we want to give one example where there has at least been an effort to incorporate some of these principles, whether it was explicitly with this understanding or not. And this is the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. This is an agreement that has been often called weak because it doesn't really fit the standard model. It is not a top-down control model, but I think you can only think of it as weak if you assume that the only way to get people to do anything is to set hard targets and then punish them if they don't comply. We tried that in climate. We tried that with Kyoto. We tried that with the Copenhagen negotiations in 2009 of getting agreement on sharing pain, and we utterly failed. So the Paris Agreement takes advantage of some underlying realities that turned out to be very helpful. One is that several of the actions that you really want to take in order to address climate are also actions you really want to take for other reasons. If you want to get air pollution under control, which kills millions of people a year, many of the things that you do to do that also have climate benefits. If you want to focus on restoring agricultural productivity because soils are being depleted around the world, some of what you do to embed carbon in the soil to improve soil productivity also has climate benefits. And so the idea behind the Paris Agreement model is that every country that is party to the treaty comes in with their own nationally determined contributions. What are the things that it makes sense for them to be doing, or technologies where they want to be the world leader, whatever it may be. And they say, these are the things that we commit to doing over the upcoming years. And everybody adds them all together and says, well, how far does that get us in addressing climate? It's not going to get us all the way there, but what it does do, it gives people a focal point around which to coalesce. And it helps people think in terms of, for things that we want to do anyhow, how do we design them to be as climate friendly as possible, since we're going to do them anyhow? That was the starting point for the Paris Agreement model. But it has a couple of other points that are really important. One is that one of the few requirements is that countries then report on the degree to which they are doing the things that they said they would do. And that kind of reporting requirement in and of itself can influence more behavior. It also requires that everyone come together every 5 years in a global stock taking. Where has the technology taken us now? Now that renewables have become so much cheaper and are cost competitive with fossil fuels in many cases, even without subsidies, are there ways we can start sharing them and implementing greater use of these new technologies? What is the science now telling us on how threatening climate actually is for each member? The final piece where Paris really had a breakthrough was in its strong engagement of actors other than central governments. Most international treaty thinking had usually been based on, you get the capitals together and nobody else matters. Well, with climate, cities and subnational actors, civil society actors, private sector actors are all fundamentally important. Global life is organized into a massive array of local, regional, transnational networks that are not government-based and that have their own reasons for taking climate action. The Paris Agreement model very actively supports and engages with that whole variety of actors. Because of that, even with the advent of the new administration in the United States, which is so hostile to climate action, there has been so much going on beyond the federal government that the United States is still within shouting distance of meeting its original Paris goals. And the report that we have up there on the screen, which assessed all of the large-scale multi-stakeholder initiatives around climate, argues that if all of those were to be implemented at scale, and these are not central governments, this is the everybody else. If those were to be implemented in full, we would actually come quite close to sticking to the 2 degrees Celsius, that is the upper limit that the Paris Agreement model suggests that we should be pursuing. So it can be done. And to wrap this all up, I think it helps to start by thinking how different the 21st century really is from the past. And that is part of why we have to think about it differently. We see that technology is changing not just the nature of economies, it's changing the nature of human interactions and the scale of human interactions. We're seeing shifting climate patterns on an extraordinary scale already, and that's just one of the sets of major disruptions of planetary systems that we have unleashed. Humanity has never experienced anything like this before. We know that power has been flowing away from our traditional governors, our governments and other bodies, but it's not flowing toward any well-structured institutions. We know that social unrest has been rising along with inequality, and we know that there is great uncertainty regarding what the jobs of the future will be and what the basic social contract will look like. So we don't know who is going to be managing the global order, and we don't know what our economies and our societies are going to look like.
So given what Anne and I have been saying, the basic point we're trying to get across is that when we're dealing with really complex systems, there's just no way to predict the exact consequences of systemic fragility. And to deal with this, we've laid out a few principles. And effectively, it'll need a new mindset to produce a transition to a new political economy. And it's not going to be easy. I mean, we're at the business end of the election season here in the US, and we can say, suffice it to say, that it's not going to be easy to create this new political economy. And given what Anna just said, we're going to need experimentation and success at scale. And this has to be a global effort if we have to deal with some of the challenges that we're facing. And we can think of the COVID pandemic as a societal stress test, and the lessons we learn, and learning has to be part of resilience, that they'll be important for facing up to the whole set of systemic hazards that we confront. Okay, with that, Renee, back to you.
Great, thank you, Sunil and Anne. That was quite fascinating. I'm now going to ask Joaquim Vespignani to also join the panel, but there is a question here from Boyd Blackwell, who says, many thanks to the presenters. Is there a paper that you have written on your ideas, and if so, where can I find it?
That's an easy one to answer. So yes, we did an article in the IMF's Journal of Finance and Development in June of this year. It's on the IMF website. And perhaps we could also share the link with you, Renee, that could be made available to the participants. But that's a fairly short piece, and it's an overview of some of the ideas that we've just been discussing. But obviously, this is a much, much broader conversation. We're hoping to do more writing on this in the future. We're also hoping to engage in a global discussion around these ideas.
Warwick, do you have a question?
Yes, I did. Thanks very much, Anne and Sunil. That was really fascinating. I think it's a major contribution to a debate that's going to have to be had over coming years. I guess what I found interesting was the difference between complex systems and complicated systems. And as soon as you framed it that way, the logic of your argument just came out just absolutely perfectly. What worries me, though, is it points out, and particularly the example of the Paris Accord, but it points out that the current federal government systems of most countries is really not fit for purpose. And so the implications of what you're saying is quite profound. Now, the question is there an example of a political structure in any country in the world that enables the sort of strategies that you're talking about to go forward? Or do we have to really fundamentally rethink every political structure?
There are pieces, and I'm sure Sunil would like to jump in on this one too. So the Singapore government explicitly sets out to do some of the things that you need to do as a government if you're going to deal with truly complex systems. They have a Center for Strategic Futures that's part of the Prime Minister's office that was actually set up when I was living there a few years ago, that is focused on how do you do scenarios and other futures kinds of approaches, as Sunil mentioned. Not that you're going to predict the future, but so that you have a better understanding of the range of possibilities that are out there. They claim to have a whole of government approach that, again, is trying to break down the silos. They probably do it about as well as anybody does. There are lots of other governments that I've seen do it in bits and pieces. Like I was doing a fair amount of work on climate adaptation, not mitigation, but adaptation to the effects that we know we're going to have, where again, you're going to need a whole of government and whole of society approach because society is going to be facing such major shocks. There are several governments, particularly in developing countries, that are putting together at the central level bodies that are meant to try to break down the silos. The UK government has had some of this as well as some futures work, but it's very episodic. It's in little bits and pieces. There's something of a global community of government officials and some of their advisors who are trying to promote this approach, but it has a very long way to go.
I mean, let me just add by saying that to the extent that we've been buffeted by two systemic shocks in the last 15 years, a financial crisis and now a pandemic, surely if they don't force us to think systemically, and given what Anna just said, if you really are to address the systemic problems, both in terms in specific countries as well as globally, we're going to have to institutionalize or maybe create new agencies and new frameworks. And importantly, these frameworks will have to have durable ways of collaborating internationally. I mean, think about what we are about to do. We are about to develop a vaccine. If this vaccine is developed in a particular country or a particular set of countries, how is it going to be distributed to the rest of the world? I mean, this pandemic is global. It's a truly global crisis. We'll have to find ways to make decisions which are going to be difficult. If a vaccine is developed in a particular country, how much of that vaccine should be kept in reserve? How much should be distributed internationally? How should this information be made available internationally? Those are hard questions, but I think we're going to be forced to think through them. So the point we're trying to get across is that macroprudential risk, when I think about the financial sector, was not on the table before 2008. When we had the financial crisis, all of a sudden, many countries got together and said, we've got to have an agency, an institution, and where we house it, whether in the Treasury or the central bank, which has to think of the financial sector as a whole, which has to be, and when Anna and I were discussing this, we said that we have to move away from mere sectoral considerations to looking at economic resilience. It has to be much broader. You can't get a financially sound, you can't get a healthy financial sector without having a healthy economy. So there has to be much broader thinking involved. And I think we're just at the beginning of that. I think that we're just being forced to think along those lines. And we're hoping that, these things will be institutionalized in certain ways.
Joachim, I believe you have a question.
Yes. Can you see me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good. No, I have two questions. My first question is regarding the three spheres that you show at the beginning of the presentation. I was wondering how different are for emerging markets and developed countries. That is during the COVID-19 crisis. I mean, if during the COVID-19 crisis, that will play a different role.
So let me take that. Let me start with that, and then Anne can jump in. Think about emerging markets and developing countries. I mean, I think that for each of those spheres, the challenge in many of the emerging and developing countries is going to be much more severe, right? Crowded cities, weak health systems, and large informal sectors, right? Take the example of India. When the economy was shut down in March, suddenly, there was a huge migration of labor, which went from the urban areas where they were in the informal sector, and many of them were just trudging back home. I mean, it caused a lot of problems, caused a lot of issues, and in fact, in some sense, even took the virus from the urban areas into the rural areas. And now we are seeing a huge spreading of the virus all over India. Now, of course, emerging markets are in a different situation compared to developed countries, both in terms of state administrative capacity and state fiscal capacity. Emerging markets are seeing the mother of all sudden stops in terms of capital flows from abroad, a dramatic fall in remittances, breakdown of trade and disruption of international supply chains. We're seeing collapse of commodity prices. So the stress in emerging markets is much higher. And close to 100 countries have approached the IMF for assistance. So the headwinds that they are facing in terms of fiscal space, limited ability to do QE, ability to borrow in local currency. Some are facing debt distress, some have low foreign exchange reserves. And then in the background of anemic global demand, global supply chains being disrupted. So the stress in emerging markets is of a different magnitude compared to the developed countries. And if you look at some of the numbers that the IMF has put out, the amount of money that the developed countries have been able to put out, both in terms of to sustain the economy as well as to deal with the pandemic, is multiples of what the emerging markets have been able to do. But given this is a global pandemic, we have to be able to find ways in which we can assist the poorer countries to deal with the pandemic. And if you think about it from the from a systemic perspective, from the globe as a whole, the cost of the pandemic is basically a deadweight loss, right? It's just making our whole system much more fragile, because it's a cost imposed already on a system which was, dealing with a lot of structural issues. I don't know whether that answers the question.
Yes.
And I think the only thing that I would add to that is the complexity framework puts even more pressure on state capacity. It's not that bringing in all these other actors alleviates state responsibility, it just changes the nature of it. And it requires different kinds of capacity. That's why I've spent a lot of the last 10 years creating different kinds of master's programs, first one in Singapore and now one for the Thunderbird School of Global Management, which are really focused on how do you train people, particularly the mid-career people and up who are current decision makers, in how to think about complex systems and how to manage them. Because it isn't enough to say, oh yes, a system is complex and end there. You really have to think through what are the set of management skills and tools that you now employ, which are different, which have to do with these understanding multiple layers of government, understanding the roles of non-state actors, understanding how to bring them together, which is its own set of skills, and understanding what makes for robust decision-making, as opposed to the optimization techniques that we have been teaching in business and policy schools for decades.
Okay, thank you. I have a second question, and that is a question regarding the role of technology. Because I have a kind of a conflict views about technology and the role in terms of systematic hazard, in the sense that technology also improve information or information dissemination, but somehow seems to be quite controversial, if you want, because we see in Facebook and in many others technological platform, different views, and I have the feeling that it's actually sort of creating more polarization than others, or I just don't know if this is a cause or consequences, or consequence, and that's why I was wondering about the role of technology.
I think it's a great question. So it depends, of course, on which technologies you're talking about, but the World Economic Forum uses this language of a fourth industrial revolution, that it's not just the digital technologies that we've come to know and love or loathe in recent decades, but a whole set of biotechnologies and other technologies that are really fundamentally reshaping the world and already starting to do so. And they're all complex systems, and we are not well set up to govern and regulate or even understand them. So I think it's a very profound question. This is where doing some scenarios is really a useful way of thinking about where we might end up with these. It's very easy to imagine a world of digital technologies that is completely torn apart, as you can see in the American political system right now. You can also imagine the use of certain kinds of digital technologies, fintech technologies, that can allow for a completely different financial system, a citizen-centered financial system that is able to aggregate very small amounts of money and give people a say in how it gets invested, using criteria that are not just the short-term financial returns that the current intermediaries tend to focus on. There was a quite brilliant report that was released this morning out of the United Nations. The Secretary General has been running a digital task force on, I don't recall the exact title, but it's essentially, how do you create a citizen-centered financial system using these new digital technologies. And it had an extraordinary range of public and private sector people on it thinking through these issues. So the prospects that technology could create these kinds of transformations in systems in a positive sense is just as strong as that they could drive systems into the ground. It really depends on how we choose to use them and how good we are at quickly understanding them.
So let me add, I mean, I think it's a very important question because take the political and social sphere. Technology has made greater connectedness, increased access to information, but at the same time, it's led to more divisiveness. I mean, think the way the media has been transformed. Think about the assault on the nature of truth. People talk about alt realities and alternate facts and so on and so forth. A lot of this technology, instead of allowing us to pool opinions, has actually segregated people, and we are in our own little echo chambers. So the way the technology is utilized, I think, is very, very important. And you can see that it has, as you suggested, added to the divisiveness of the politics in many of the countries. Well, the same issue arises in the economic and financial sphere. As Anne has just mentioned, fintech. Clearly technological progress is important for productivity growth. But there are issues raised by labor-saving technological progress, right? Where are the new jobs going to come from? The information economy in a natural way leads to the concentration of economic and financial power, and consequently possibly political power. So how are you going to deal with the concentration of power? People have argued that there's been a decline in labor power over the years. The gig economy. Is the gig economy really a sign of progress, or is it made labor even more vulnerable? Income instability, income inequality, rethinking of corporate governance. This is going to be part and parcel of thinking in what Anne has described as the new digital economy. So I think it's going to raise a lot of questions as to how we structure our economies, because technology is going to allow us to restructure it in many ways. In the environmental sphere, again, we're going to need technology to deal with our environmental challenges, but there too we have to be cognizant of what new fuels, what new production processes, and so on and so forth. So I think that technology is both going to offer us opportunities, but there are also going to be pitfalls that we need to be able to see emerging to be able to deal with that. So I think what you ask is a very profound question. I mean, I don't think anyone really has an answer, but I think it's an important thing to think through.
Thank you.
Our next question is from Binquin Lee. Nice to see you.
Hi. Thank you very much for the very informative discussion. And I have one question regarding this whole society, whole government, whole society approach. Because I noticed that even during this pandemic and in China, they are trying to use the same kind of approach and trying to say that they are trying to basically mobilize everybody in order to fight against this at grassroots level and all these things. But there is one issue is that when you adopt this type of approach, and because the country is so diverse and the capacity is so different, what works in one part, when you go to another region, they may consider it suffocating. When they try to kind of align this kind of, particularly when you are facing the same challenge across the whole country. So how to manage this kind of a coordination and have this kind of approach, resilient approach, without also at the same time taking into account the differences. It seems to be quite a problem.
That is a profoundly important question. I am so glad you raised it. Partly because I did quite a lot of work looking at governance in China. So I'm very aware of the kinds of wow, what a diverse country. And operating at a scale that no country has ever operated at before. And it raises one of the most fundamental points about managing complex systems, which is that it cannot be done through a centralized top-down process. Because when you have, as I said earlier, this great heterogeneity of agents across the system that you are interested in, nobody at the center can possibly have enough information to make decisions that work. What the center can do is be a coordinator, it can be an establisher of a shared vision around which people can organize themselves in different places. But the most important way that you actually deal with complex problems is, when you're talking about human systems, is you think about the norms that drive behavior. And what you need to do is focus on what shifts the norms that people are using, whether these are internalized norms, what they think they ought to be doing. So in countries that have been fairly successful in dealing with the pandemic, it's only been partly what the government rules have been. It's also been that there has been an acceptance of, oh, we should all do certain things. We should all socially distance. We should all wear masks. We should all do whatever it is. Because there is an internalization of, this is the way I should behave across very heterogeneous populations in some cases. I have often seen people look at Singapore and say that Singapore ought to be the exemplar for how countries should be governed. And Singapore, you look inside, it has its own issues, although by most standards, it's quite well governed. But it's tiny. It's even now only 5.5 million people. You can do things with governance at that scale that you cannot do in any large country. And dealing with complex problems in a large country requires a degree of freedom of action at other levels. This is part of why we emphasize so much multi-layered governance. That just won't work in a purely centralized system. So as I said, I think it's a profoundly important question.
Okay, our next question is from Yeong Kai.
Hello, thank you very much for the presentation. So I'm Yeong from the Treasury. Actually, I'm a policy advisor in the government. And I just wanted to say that one important kind of element of the work we do is usually to present the trade-offs, of probably a complex kind of problem in a very simple way to the policymakers and to the general public. So they can kind of use that information to make a decision, and really kind of very often have to kind of present that as a trade-off and probably fit that into optimization framework. While your seminar kind of suggested that this is probably kind of quite dangerous or less doable, with all these new problems, which has a very complex nature. So I wonder how we can reconcile this. Still, we can kind of use the complex information to communicate in a simple way and powerful and effective way to kind of get things done. And is there any possibility that we can reconcile this? Otherwise, the stakeholders are going to disengage. They tell them that this is so complicated, we have to kind of consider a million things. It's not going to work.
I mean, can I?
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No. All yours, Sunil.
Okay. What I was going to say is that two things that we've emphasized here. One is multi-layered governance, and the other is empowerment of self-organization. It's saying that we're going to have multiple decision nodes. I mean, think about a country where you have a federal government, you have state governments, you have cities, you have regional governments, you have things at the district level. That there has to be a flow of information. There has to be decision nodes where the central government can just not have all the information available and all the capacity to take decisions, which may be quite different at different localities, as you point out. So that's where the trade-offs will have to be decided and then conveyed up the chain to the central authorities. the command and control system just requires too much information and too much centralization of capacity. And in a complex system, that is just simply not possible because of the varieties and ways in which people may have to react at the local level.
Just to follow up on that, just to follow up on that a little bit, you specifically are talking about cost-benefit analysis kind of approaches. They are problematic, but they're problematic even when you're talking about complicated problems, because the cost and benefits that get taken into account, these are not externally determined technocratic realities. They're very much political choices, but they're not treated as though they are actually political choices. And so there is often in this kind of decision-making a false degree of certainty about what the trade-offs actually are. This is exacerbated dramatically when you're talking about complex problems. So yeah, there really is a problem with some of the methodologies that we've been using in public affairs and public policy management. They don't fit the complex problem realities.
Yeah, we just have one last question. We don't have very much time left. So it's a question posed by Salah Al-Jabri on how easy or difficult will it be to find cooperation between developed and developing countries to improve the global system?
How much time do we have left?
You can just...
Oh boy.
Well, I think that the international community is trying to mobilize resources which can be used by the emerging and developing countries. But I think it's going to be difficult. I mean, in the sense that it's a truly global pandemic. Its revival may not be synchronized. It's going to be depending on how countries deal with the virus. The focus is going to be on economic resilience, not just financial resilience. And for all we know, we still could have financial breakdowns going forward. So I think the G20 and the international organizations are trying to mobilize resources. They're trying to put frameworks for debt forgiveness and so on and so forth. But when it's a stressed environment globally, it's not easy. The politics becomes difficult, and managing the issues become much more difficult. So I think it's a good question. I think clearly much greater international solidarity is required, but it remains to be seen whether it will be forthcoming, given the circumstances in which we find ourselves.
Okay, and I'm an eternal optimist. So my view on this is that when crises get bad enough, people do change their behavior, and we can hope that there is enough depth of thinking and understanding of how bad the crises are getting that we will end up with some positive results coming out of where we are now that will include much deeper shared understanding across developed and developing countries. And of course, many of the developing countries had been developing fairly quickly, and some of the developed countries might not be doing so well in the future. So there might not be quite as great disparity as we've had. But I think the most important point is that when we look at these things, to not look at the usual indicators. Looking just at GDP, we know, is a wildly misleading indicator of so many things. Looking just at what central governments are doing is, again, wildly misleading. I think we need to get a better understanding of the larger sets of flows of different types of human society, different types of actors, and as we're looking to make changes so that we can reckon with these systemic hazards, looking at a much wider range of potential levers and actors than we are accustomed to doing, because that's what we're going to need if we're going to reckon with systemic hazards.
Great, thank you. Well, I think that's a good note to finish up the webinar. So thank you so much, Anne and Sunil, for such a fascinating discussion today. And I'd like to ask the attendees at home, we can't hear you, but please join me in thanking Anne and Sunil for their presentation. So we really appreciate it. Our next webinar is going to be on September the 9th, and it's on the topic of Japan's economic crisis and recovery. The speakers are Toshitaka Sakin from Hitotsubashi University, who was chief economist at the Bank of Japan for many years, and Sagiri Kitao from the University of Tokyo, and the recipient of the Nekahara Prize given to the Japanese economist under 45, whose work has gained international recognition. And that session will be chaired by Ippei Fujiwara, who is the Deputy Director of CALMA. So thank you